Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You were the reason why this content remains banished to the Shadow Realm. And today, we are going to discuss more extinct locomotives. I was gonna wait a bit longer to do a sequel as part of this series, but it did so well and so many people asked me for a follow-up that I decided, what the heck, why not? Okay, these are 5 more extinct locomotives. The New South Wales D58 class. This class of locomotive was constructed by the New South Wales Government Railways in Australia. They're 482s, which are classically called mountain types, and they were technically just a modified version of the preceding D57 class. The changes to it were meant to help it run on lines that had a tighter loading gauge, such as the main North Line to Broadmeadow. It used a rack and pinion valve gear, which is weird for the middle cylinder, and used smaller cylinders in general. They also used a Woodard divided drive of twin coupling rods between the second and third driving wheels. And given they were pretty big by Australian standards with very large fireboxes, they also included a mechanical stoker, which was nice. They first entered service in March of 1950, and only 13 wound up completed, because during the same time, the railway decided to move to diesel power, which did not bode well for the D58s. But even if they didn't do that, they honestly didn't turn out as great as they'd hoped. On paper, that rack and pinion valve gear should have been superior, but in practice, it required a lot more maintenance and lubrication to keep it going. This increased operating costs. To make matters worse, smaller diameter cylinders of the 58s demanded a later cutoff, and that used more steam, making them really uneconomical compared to the preceding 57s. But to be fair, if it was used on the lines it was meant to, it actually did alright. It just almost never was used on those lines. They were mainly used on the main western line to Lithgow instead, and they didn't even last 10 years. They were all withdrawn by July of 1957 and scrapped by March 1964. However, a few of their tenders are still hanging around. The one that belonged to 5808 lies near Canberra Station, which was converted to an old fuel tank for a diesel shunter. Another is actually at the Dorrigo Steam Railway and Museum. And their preceding sister class, the D57s, do have a surviving example. Number 5711 managed to survive into preservation, and is currently being statically restored at the Valley Heights Locomotive Depot Heritage Museum. The MÁV Class 601. This is a Hungarian locomotive, a 4-cylinder Malay, and they, for their time, were enormous, big, chungus. They were actually nicknamed the Giant, or, get this, Big Boy. Yes, really, they called them Big Boys before the American Big Boys. 601s weren't quite as big as the more famous American Big Boys, but for their day, they were pretty friggin' big. They were 22.5 meters long and could produce 22,000 kilowatts of power. They were the largest and most powerful steam locomotives in Europe prior to and during the First World War. As 2660s, their power allowed them to move much heavier freight trains than any other locomotive could on their own. Trains were getting longer in Europe, especially during the war, and that extra power was needed. A total of 60 were actually produced, so you'd think at least one might scrape by and be preserved, but sadly, no. Not a single one of these incredible locomotives survived into preservation. Based on what I can tell, they were all scrapped by the mid-20th century. The Baltimore and Ohio Class EM1. The EM1s were a group of 30 Baldwin-built 2884s. These were Yellowstones, simple articulated steam locomotives, and they appear pretty late on the scene in terms of the steam age, being built and put into service during World War II. At the time, B&O was actually interested in dieselizing and didn't want to buy any new steam locomotives, but during World War II, it was difficult to actually get a hold of any new diesel locomotives. Production had been minimized due to the war effort, so they just went with new steam locomotives. They were, despite of course being very, very large steam locomotives, technically the smallest Yellowstones built. But overall size, of course, isn't everything. Not only were they considered a very handsome class of locomotive, but they were also extremely reliable. They were very, very, very good. Despite being forced to buy them, B&O was happy with them. So happy that they actually plan on preserving at least 2 of the 30 that had been built. But given the fact they're on this list, you probably know where this is going. The first in the class, number 7600, was already earmarked for preservation by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. That makes sense, it's the first in the class, and a good representation of her sisters. She was sitting at Benwood Junction in West Virginia, and she was about to be moved to the museum, but a yardmaster, who completely misunderstood why she was being moved, thought she was supposed to be scrapped. So he ordered her to be taken to the scrapyard and broken up. This was insanely infuriating for everybody else involved, because the people who had saved her actually worked hard to doll her up and make sure she was ready for display, which she was. And then she was cut into pieces. By the time Baltimore and Ohio's management had realized what had happened, it was too late for them to do anything about it. 7600 was gone. Though, for what it's worth, they absolutely fired the heck out of the yardmaster for being a moron. Number 7609 was also supposed to be preserved, and she was actually offered to the city of Wheeling, West Virginia, for static display. A lot of cities, especially when a class is associated with them, are offered one whenever they're retired, as a nice display piece for tourists and residents alike. Anyway, Wheeling said no, so they scrapped her, which just seems like such a waste. I mean, I get it, they're very large, you would need to find space for, but come on! This is definitely a far more frustrating story than I care to admit. Whenever a company just casually decides to scrap a whole class, I mean, that's annoying, but it's not surprising. But in this case, B&O tried to save at least 2 of them, and due to various reasons, they were lost anyway. It's just disappointing. The Furness Railway K2 class. These quirky little engines were a group of 8 440 steam locomotives. The class would technically be called an American, but these are, well, Scottish. They were built by Sharp Stewart and Company of Glasgow for the Furness Railway. 6 of them in 1896, and then 2 more in 1900. They were meant to supersede the 120 class on heavier trains. They weren't necessarily large or grand, but they were very good in their day, and did solid work for many years, well into the 1920s. If they look a little familiar, well, that's because these guys are actually the basis for my favorite Thomas the Tank Engine character, Edward, the Blue Engine. Edward is just the goodest boy on that railway. I mean, let's be fair, Edward is just such a wholesome character. I love his story arcs. But sadly, outside of Edward, safe on the island of Sodor, all of his siblings would be destroyed. There were only 8, like I said, and they were withdrawn between 1929 and 1931. The Victorian Railways S class. They were a class of 462 express passenger steam locomotives operated by the Victorian Railways in Australia between 1928 and 1954. And the S's wound up being the most prestigious locomotive class until diesel electrics would come along. But, well, you knew that was coming. They were actually the first Pacific types on the VR, as well as the first 3-cylinder locomotive type. They were powerful and very fast, reducing travel time on any lines they worked on. They were probably most famous for the Spirit of Progress, the premier express passenger train on the Victorian Railways. They were streamlined to pull this particular set of coaches, and they were instantly recognizable as a result of the distinction. They were also fitted with long-range tenders, And even though they only ever had 4 of these, they've utilized them heavily. They ran annual mileages double that of any other class of locomotives on Victorian railways, and by 1954 had run a combined total of approximately 5,700,000 miles. That's 9,200,000 kilometers. They were such an impressive piece of locomotive technology, able to accomplish a level of work that would have taxed almost every other kind of locomotive that VR had. And yet, sadly, all of the S's, well, are gone. They were, in fact, the very first casualty of Victorian Railways' dieselization program. The transition began very quickly when the B classes were delivered in 1952. The S classes already had some limited utility due to their high axle load, and their maintenance costs, due to their age and really high mileage, were getting outlandish, so the commissioners sought to withdraw them from service and scrap all of them as their mechanical condition dictated. The first one to go was S301 in September of 1953 due to her worn cylinders. She was scrapped just the following month. S302 and S303 were both scrapped in 1954, and the last to go was actually the first ever built, S300. She was withdrawn in June of 1954 and recorded as being scrapped 3 months later, on the 17th of September, 1954. This fact was actually absolutely infuriating to the preservationist movement down in Australia, so much so that it actually kick-started the whole thing into high gear. Due to them being just straight up gone, it surprised people, and got many who didn't care before suddenly involved in the preservation of these historic locomotives. The Australian Railway Historical Society even notes that the loss of the S-Class helped to galvanize railway enthusiasts into lobbying for the preservation of other locomotives, such as the X-Class, as well as the establishment of the Australian Railway Historical Society Museum. So, the death of the S's in particular helped save other locomotives in Australia who otherwise would have been lost. So that's something. And they were able to salvage some components of them. Their tenders were actually very large, and they found uses for them as tankers for weed spraying of the Victorian tracks. And their frames and bogies were sometimes converted into heavy-duty flat wagons. 2 of those tender frames were earmarked for preservation by the Newport Railway Museum, and they're actually currently being used as workshop vehicles at the Newport workshops. Another one is stored by Steam Rail Victoria, and the 4th is in the possession of Seymour Railway Heritage Centre. One of the S-Class's whistles also managed to survive, and when the Australian Railway Historical Society operated a 50th anniversary run of the Spirit of Progress on the 14th of November 1987, they fitted an R-Class locomotive, R707, with that whistle, so she could recreate the long-lost echo of the S-Class. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Sumdu267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Matthew Gavin, Arthur Roy, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Parsons Railroad Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Ohio Trucker 1, and Ty Hammonds Jr. Till next time, this is Darkness, and bid you all a fond farewell.